The accepted story begins in the English countryside. The Boleyn family is usually introduced as a successful but relatively recent arrival among England's rising elite. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, became a skilled diplomat, courtier, and royal servant during the reign of Henry VIII. Through intelligence, connections, and careful political advancement, he positioned his family near the center of power. Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from one of England's most influential noble families. Through her, and possessed a connection to the established aristocracy. The Howard lineage linked her to a much older network of English political power, giving the Boleyn children a place among the elite. The official narrative is therefore straightforward. Anne Boleyn was a woman born into privilege, educated in European courts, and transformed by circumstance into the second wife of King Henry VIII. Her ancestry was English. Her ambitions were connected to the Tudor world, and her rise represented the arrival of a new kind of court family. For many generations, that explanation was sufficient, until historians began looking more closely at the world before and became famous. The first crack was not discovered through a dramatic revelation. It came through the slow process of genealogy. The Boleyn name itself was not originally fixed in the form history remembers. Like many medieval and early modern surnames, it changed through language, geography, and record-keeping. Earlier forms connected the family to the name Boleyn, a variation that appears in English records before the family adopted the more recognizable Boleyn form. This matters because surnames were not permanent markers of identity during this period. They shifted with pronunciation, social movement, and political circumstances. The deeper historians looked, the clearer it became that the Boleyn story was not simply the story of an English noble family appearing from nowhere. It was the story of movement. The family's connections extended beyond England. Records place earlier generations within communities shaped by trade, diplomacy, and contact with continental Europe. Anne herself spent important years in the courts of France and the Burgundian Netherlands, absorbing languages, culture, and political ideas that later influenced her role at the English court. The strongest objection must be acknowledged here. Some historians argue that attempts to emphasize continental connections risk exaggerating ordinary medieval mobility. Families moved. Merchants traded internationally. Nobles maintained foreign relationships. A connection to Europe does not automatically transform a family's identity. This is a legitimate challenge. It cannot be dismissed. The research team acknowledged it directly. The answer lies not in one isolated clue, but in the accumulation of records. Family relationships, diplomatic documents, naming patterns, and historical environments surrounding the Boleyn rise. The first crack does not destroy the traditional story. It simply opens a door. And behind that door was a much older question. Where did this family actually come from before history began watching them? The archive rarely announces its discoveries. Most historical mysteries begin with someone searching for something else. The investigation into Anne Boleyn's ancestry did not begin with a hunt for a secret bloodline. It began with historians attempting to understand the political and social world that produced the Tudor court. Researchers studying the Boleyn family, including historians examining Tudor genealogy and early modern networks of power, were not trying to rewrite Anne's identity. They were reconstructing the ordinary mechanisms of inheritance, marriage, property, and ambition that shaped families during the 15th and 16th centuries. Among these scholars was Eric Ives, whose work on Anne Boleyn focused primarily on her political role, education, and the circumstances surrounding her rise and fall. His research demonstrated something important. Anne's story could not be separated from the international world around her. She was not formed only by England. She was shaped by Europe. Ives and other historians examined surviving correspondence, diplomatic records, and court documents that placed the Boleyn family inside a wider network of connections. Thomas Boleyn's career required movement between courts. Anne's education exposed her to French language and customs. The family's advancement depended on their ability to operate in a world where borders were constantly crossed by diplomats, merchants, and nobles. The archival evidence creates the first independent track. The Boleyn family's identity was not a single point on a map. It was a collection of relationships. But archival evidence has limits. Documents preserve what people recorded. They do not preserve everything that existed. A missing record does not prove a missing event. A surviving document does not always reveal the full reality behind it. This is why historians compare multiple sources. The strongest evidence does not come from one family tree created centuries later. It comes from patterns appearing across different records. Property documents reveal social status. Marriage records reveal alliances. Court records reveal political networks. Letters reveal personal connections. Together, they show a family becoming more powerful through adaptation. The Boleyns were not unusual in this regard. Early modern Europe was filled with families who changed language, location, and social position as opportunities appeared. But Anne's case became different because the consequences were enormous. A family that spent generations climbing through networks of influence eventually produced a woman whose marriage crisis helped reshape the religious and political structure of England. The question was never simply who Anne Boleyn was. The deeper question was how many generations of movement and transformation existed before the world remembered her name. And to answer that, historians had to look beyond documents alone. They had to examine the science of ancestry itself. The most important piece of evidence in this investigation is also the piece that does not exist. Anne Boleyn does not have a confirmed genetic profile. No authenticated DNA study has established her ancestry. No scientific analysis has produced a genetic map that can reveal her hidden origins. Any claim that DNA has proven a specific ancestry for and must be treated with caution. This absence is important. Modern genetics has transformed historical research. Ancient DNA has allowed scientists to study migration, population change, and family relationships in ways earlier generations could never imagine. Human remains have revealed forgotten connections between ancient communities and modern populations. But genetics requires a physical link, a verified sample, a confirmed identity, a reliable chain of evidence. For Anne Boleyn, that chain does not currently exist. Instead, historians must rely on another form of reconstruction, the archive. The surviving evidence suggests that Anne's ancestry belonged to the complicated world of late medieval England, where families were constantly shaped by migration, marriage, and political exchange. Her paternal line connects to the Boleyn family of Norfolk, a region where prosperous landowners, merchants, and administrators could rise through education and royal service. Her maternal ancestry through Elizabeth Howard connected her to the Howard family, one of the most powerful noble houses in England. But ancestry is not only about famous surnames. It is also about forgotten connections. The Boleyn family story existed within a broader European environment where English families interacted with continental communities through trade, diplomacy, and education. Anne's years in Europe are especially significant. Before becoming queen, she spent time at the French court and within the cultural sphere influenced by the Burgundian Netherlands. There she encountered Renaissance ideas, religious debates, and artistic movements that shaped her worldview. This creates the second evidence track. The documentary record shows movement. The cultural record shows influence. This is where the two tracks begin moving toward the same conclusion. The archives do not reveal a hidden genetic identity. They reveal something more historically accurate. Identity was never as simple as later generations imagined. The steelman argument remains important. A skeptic could say that international connections were normal among wealthy families. A period of foreign education does not mean a family possessed a different origin story. That is correct. This is a legitimate challenge. It cannot be dismissed. The research team acknowledged it directly. The answer is not that Anne Boleyn belonged to some unknown ancestry waiting to be uncovered. The evidence does not support that claim. The answer is that her family existed in a world where modern ideas of nationality did not fully apply. Before passports, before national borders became rigid, before identity was reduced to a single label, families were shaped by movement. And Boleyn's ancestry was not a mystery because it was hidden. It was a mystery because history itself was far more connected than later generations wanted to remember. And there was one more layer to this story. The reason these identities became simplified was not accidental. It was part of a much larger historical system. The most revealing moment in Anne Boleyn's ancestry is not found in a missing document or an undiscovered grave. It is found in the meeting point between what survives and what has disappeared. For centuries, historians have followed two separate paths. One path followed the documents. The other followed the world that created those documents. The first track showed a family rising through English society, using education, marriage, diplomacy, and royal service to gain influence. The second showed a Europe where people, languages, and customs cross boundaries constantly. This is where the two tracks meet. The documentary evidence and the historical context were pointing in the same direction. Anne Boleyn did not emerge from a simple, isolated English world. She emerged from a network society where identity was created through connections, and this changes the way we understand her, and was not simply the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, the ambitious courtier who placed his family near the throne. She was also the product of a generation shaped by European Renaissance culture, religious transformation, and political uncertainty. There is another detail that is often overlooked. The people who lived through this period would not have viewed Ancestry in the way modern audiences often do. A person's identity was shaped by family loyalty, religion, language, occupation, reputation, and allegiance. Blood mattered, but so did belonging. This is where modern genetic thinking can sometimes create confusion when applied to historical figures. DNA can reveal biological relationships, but it cannot fully explain how a person understood themselves. A genetic connection does not automatically tell us a person's culture. A surname does not automatically tell us a person's origins. A kingdom does not automatically define a person's identity. The story of Anne Boleyn also remains connected to living communities today. Historians, genealogists, and descendants of Tudor-era families continue to study these records, not because they are searching for scandal, but because family history is one of the ways societies remember themselves. The inheritance of the Tudor period survives in archives, buildings, literature, and family traditions. It survives in the communities that continue to study the period. And it survives in the questions people still ask about the individuals who shaped it. There is one final piece of the puzzle. The reason families like the Boleyns became simplified was not because the evidence was unavailable. It was because history was often written inside systems that rewarded certain identities and ignored others. To understand Anne Boleyn's ancestry, we have to understand the world that decided which parts of a person's past were worth preserving. The Tudor world was built on hierarchy. Names mattered, origins mattered, and social transformation required explanation. The Boleyn family's rise occurred during a period when England was changing rapidly. The old medieval order was weakening, while educated families with wealth, administrative skills, and political connections gained new opportunities. This created a historical system where identity was constantly being negotiated. A family's reputation could determine its future. Marriage could transform social position. Royal favor could rewrite a lineage within a single generation. The Boleyns were not unique in this process. Their story belongs to a much larger pattern. The Boleyn case is not unique in its structure. It is unique only in the prominence of the name attached to it. The late medieval and early modern periods produced thousands of documented cases in which families moved between social classes, regions, and cultural identities, while later generations remembered only the final version of their story. Genealogists often describe this process as pedigree collapse and social mobility, the reality that human family histories are far more interconnected than simplified family trees suggest. A person who appears to belong to one world may carry connections to many others. The same pattern appears across European history. Merchants became nobles. Foreign-born families became national symbols. Regional identities became royal identities. Over time, the complicated path disappeared, replaced by a cleaner story. This was not always deliberate deception. Often, it was the natural result of historical memory. Societies prefer simple narratives. They prefer beginnings. They prefer a clear line between outsider and insider. But the archives rarely tell such simple stories. And Boleyn's life demonstrates this tension. She became one of England's most recognizable figures. Yet the world that produced her was defined by movement and uncertainty. Her education abroad influenced her beliefs. Her family connections shaped her opportunities. Her marriage to Henry VIII transformed a private family history into a national event. And her execution created another transformation. After her death, Anne's reputation became a battlefield. Some portrayed her as a dangerous influence. Others remembered her as a woman caught inside forces larger than herself. But neither image fully captures the human being behind the name. The historical system surrounding and did not only determine how she lived, it also influenced how she was remembered. And perhaps the greatest irony is this. The woman whose marriage changed England became trapped inside a simplified story of her own identity. The record suggests something quieter, not a secret ancestry, not a hidden bloodline, but a reminder that every famous name began as something much more ordinary, a family, a place, a collection of people moving through history. The final evidence returns us to the beginning, a name, Boleyn. For centuries, that name has carried the weight of a queen, a marriage, a religious revolution, and a tragedy. But behind the symbol was a person. And Boleyn was not a genetic mystery, waiting for science to solve. She was not a hidden identity waiting to be uncovered. She was a woman who lived during a period when identity was constantly changing. Her ancestry was not a single answer. It was a story of movement. It was written in family connections, political alliances, languages learned abroad, and records preserved by people who could never have known how closely future generations would examine their lives. The surviving evidence tells us what it can. It tells us where families lived. It tells us whom they married. It tells us how they gained power. It tells us how they entered the historical record. But there are limits. There are questions that remain beyond the reach of archives. There are voices that disappeared. There are generations whose names were never written down. That is the strange reality of ancestry. Every family tree eventually reaches a point where the branches disappear into silence. The historian can follow the ink. The scientist can follow the molecule. But neither can recover every human story that existed before the record began. And Boleyn's greatest legacy was not created by her ancestry. It was created by what she did with the life she inherited. Her influence on English history, her role in the religious changes of her time, and the cultural world she helped shape remain her own achievements. The origins of a person do not define the total value of what they create. In the end, the question surrounding Anne Boleyn is not simply where she came from. It is how a person becomes remembered. A family name can become powerful. A portrait can become permanent. A story can become accepted as truth. But behind every famous image is a much older and quieter reality. A family record. A forgotten connection. A human life moving through time. And somewhere inside the surviving pages of history, the Boleyn name remains exactly what it always was. Not just the name of a queen. The name of a family that existed long before anyone was watching.